In a bustling downtown coffee shop on a crisp autumn morning, the gentle clink of coffee cups and quiet murmur of conversation created the perfect backdrop for what was about to unfold, a moment that would challenge assumptions and touch hearts across our divided city. Sarah, a 34-year-old social worker with warm brown eyes and a bright smile, had just finished her morning shift at the local community center when she noticed an elderly man struggling with his groceries outside. Without hesitation, she rushed to help him, her colorful headscarf trailing behind her in the October breeze. The man, probably in his mid-70s with weathered hands and tired blue eyes, initially tensed when she approached. His reaction was subtle, a slight flinch, a tightening of his grip on the paper bags, but Sarah had seen it countless times before. Still, she smiled and extended her hands, offering assistance with genuine warmth. "Those bags look heavy, sir. Would you like some help getting them to your car?" she asked, her voice carrying the same compassion she brought to her work with troubled teens. The man, who introduced himself as Robert, hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between Sarah's face and the ground. 20 years as a factory worker had left him with chronic back pain, and today it was particularly bad. Pride warred with necessity in his expression. What happened next would spark conversations across social media and challenge the preconceptions that often divide our communities. As Sarah helped Robert load his groceries into his old Buick, neither of them knew they were being filmed by a nearby shop's security camera, or that their simple interaction would soon touch millions of hearts. Robert's initial reluctance melted away as Sarah shared stories about her grandmother, who had taught her the importance of helping others regardless of their differences. The connection they formed in those few minutes would prove to be more than just a fleeting moment of kindness. It would become a catalyst for change in their community. But it wasn't until 3 days later, when Robert walked into the community center where Sarah worked, that the true impact of their chance encounter began to unfold. In his trembling hands, he held an envelope and a story that would bring tears to the eyes of everyone who heard it. His voice cracked as he asked the receptionist if he could speak with the angel who helped me with my groceries. Sarah's simple act of compassion had stirred something deep within Robert, forcing him to confront beliefs he held for decades. As he waited in the community center's lobby, clutching that mysterious envelope, the security camera footage of their interaction was already beginning to circulate online, touching hearts and sparking discussions about prejudice, compassion, and the power of simple human kindness. The whispers around the community center grew as staff members recognized the man from the viral video that had been making rounds on local social media, but nobody could have predicted what Robert was about to reveal, or how his response to Sarah's kindness would challenge everything people thought they knew about him. As Sarah walked down the hallway toward the lobby, unaware of the ripple effect her simple gesture had created, Robert stood up, his hands shaking and tears welling in his eyes. The envelope he held contained something that would not only change Sarah's life, but would also inspire a movement in their small city. What happened next would prove that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can crack open the hardest shells of prejudice, revealing the true colors that lie beneath years of learned bias. What Robert did next left everyone in the community center speechless, and proved that change can happen in the most unexpected ways. With tears streaming down his weathered face, Robert opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a black and white photograph from 1963, showing a young black woman holding the hand of a small white boy outside a segregated school. The photograph was worn at the edges, clearly handled countless times over the decades. Sarah leaned closer, her heart beating faster as Robert began to speak. "This was my first grade teacher, Mrs. Washington," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She protected me the day angry protesters surrounded our school during integration. I was terrified, but she held my hand and walked me safely to my mother's car. She showed me kindness when others showed hate." He paused, gathering himself. "When you helped me with those groceries, you reminded me of her. That same pure kindness, without expecting anything in return." The community center had grown quiet, with staff and visitors drawn to the unfolding scene. Robert pulled out a folded check from the envelope, his hands still shaking. "I've been saving this money for years, never quite knowing what to do with it. But now I know. It belongs here, in this community center, where you help people every day." Before he could reveal the amount, Sarah gently touched his arm. "Robert, you don't need to." But he cut her off, his blue eyes now clear and determined. "You don't understand," he said. "After Mrs. Washington helped me that day, I went home and heard my father saying terrible things about her and her people. I was young, impressionable. Over the years, I let his prejudices become my own. I became someone Mrs. Washington wouldn't have recognized." As Robert spoke, more people gathered around, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice. He described how he'd lived most of his adult life harboring biased thoughts, avoiding interactions with people who didn't look like him. "But when you approached me that day," he said to Sarah, "something broke inside me. Your kindness brought back memories of Mrs. Washington, memories I'd buried deep down." The security camera footage of their interaction had already gathered thousands of views online, but nobody knew the story behind Robert's transformation. Comments had flooded in, some cynical, others hopeful, but none knew about the photograph he carried for 60 years or the internal struggle it represented. Sarah listened intently as Robert revealed how he'd spent the 3 days since their encounter wrestling with his conscience, remembering Mrs. Washington's kindness and questioning every prejudiced thought he'd ever had. He barely slept, haunted by the realization of how far he'd strayed from the lessons of his childhood. The check in his hand represented more than just money. It was a symbol of transformation, of redemption. But as Robert began to explain its significance, a commotion near the community center's entrance drew everyone's attention. An elderly woman had just walked in, her presence causing Robert to freeze mid-sentence. The photograph in his hand trembled as he stared at the newcomer, his face draining of color. The woman, using a cane but standing proud, moved slowly through the crowd that had gathered. Her silver hair was elegantly styled, and despite her advanced age, her eyes sparkled with the same determination captured in the old photograph. As she approached Robert, the entire room held its breath, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. The connection between these three people, Sarah, Robert, and the mysterious newcomer, was about to reveal itself in a way that would challenge everything they thought they knew about fate, forgiveness, and the power of human connection. The elderly woman stood before Robert, her eyes fixed on the photograph in his trembling hands. "I remember that day like it was yesterday," she said softly, her voice carrying across the now silent community center. "You were wearing a blue sweater your mother had knitted." Robert's legs gave way, and Sarah quickly helped him into a nearby chair as recognition dawned on his face. "Mrs. Washington," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman nodded, tears welling in her eyes. At 91 years old, her mind was still sharp as ever. "I saw the video of you and this beautiful young woman," she gestured toward Sarah. "My granddaughter showed it to me on her phone. I knew I had to come, even though these old legs don't move like they used to." Sarah stood between them, witnessing a moment that felt almost sacred. Mrs. Washington reached for the photograph, her fingers brushing against Robert's as she took it. "You kept it all these years," she said, more of a statement than a question. The weight of 6 decades hung in the air between them. "I did," Robert replied, his voice breaking, "but I failed you. Everything you taught us about kindness, about seeing people for who they are, I let it all slip away." The check in his hand crumpled slightly as his grip tightened. Mrs. Washington's expression shifted, a mixture of sadness and understanding crossing her face. Then she did something unexpected. She pulled out her wallet and retrieved another copy of the same photograph. Hers was equally worn, but laminated to preserve it. "I kept it too," she said, "to remind me that change is possible, even in the darkest times." The community center staff and visitors watched in stunned silence as this remarkable scene unfolded. Sarah noticed Robert's hands were shaking more violently now, and the check he held was about to fall. As she steadied his hand, she caught a glimpse of the amount written on it. Her sharp intake of breath caused several people nearby to lean forward with curiosity. But before anyone could see the figure, Mrs. Washington placed her hand over it. "Before you do whatever you're planning to do with that check, Robert," she said, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone she'd likely used in her classroom decades ago, "there's something you need to know." She reached into her large purse and pulled out a manila envelope, yellowed with age and secured with a faded ribbon. After that day in 1963, I wrote letters to each of my students, letters about hope, about the future I dreamed they would help create. But many parents wouldn't let me give them out. She untied the ribbon with deliberate slowness. This one was meant for you. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy with anticipation as Mrs. Washington held out the sealed envelope to Robert. Sarah watched as his hands, still clutching the check, refused to move. The internal struggle playing out on his face was painful to witness, 60 years of guilt, prejudice, and regret warring with the chance for redemption. Just as Robert finally reached for the letter, the community center's door burst open. A young woman rushed in, out of breath, holding up her phone. "Grandma," she called out to Mrs. Washington, "you need to see this. The video of Mr. Robert and Sarah. It's gone viral in a way you wouldn't believe, and people are starting to share their own stories." The envelope remained suspended between them, its contents still unknown, as the implications of what was unfolding began to dawn on everyone present. This was no longer just about a simple act of kindness or one man's journey to redemption. It was becoming something much bigger, something that could ripple out far beyond the walls of this community center. Mrs. Washington's granddaughter, a journalist for the local news station, held up her phone to show them what was happening online. The original security camera footage had sparked something unprecedented. People from across the country were sharing similar stories of transformation, of moments when a simple act of kindness had shattered their prejudices. But there was something else, something that made Robert's face turn pale. Among the thousands of comments and shares, someone had posted another video from 1963. The grainy footage showed the same day captured in the photograph, but from a different angle. In it, a young Robert could be seen not just being led to safety by Mrs. Washington, but also turning back to help another child, a little black girl who had fallen in the chaos. This moment of childhood innocence, lost to time and buried under years of learned prejudice, played out on screens across the nation. I had forgotten," Robert whispered, his eyes fixed on the phone screen. "After you helped me, I went back for her. Her name was Rose." Mrs. Washington steadied herself against a chair, her expression a mix of recognition and revelation. "Rose Thompson," she said softly. "She moved away the following year. Her family couldn't take the harassment anymore." Sarah, who had been quietly supporting both Robert and Mrs. Washington, suddenly straightened. "Thompson? Did you say Rose Thompson?" Her voice carried an urgency that made everyone turn. "The new hospital board director who just approved our community health initiative. Her name is Dr. Rose Thompson." The check in Robert's hand trembled more violently now, but for a different reason. The amount written on it, meant to fund new programs at the community center, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the weight of this revelation. The manila envelope containing his unread letter felt heavier than ever. Mrs. Washington's granddaughter was already making calls, her reporter instincts kicking in. "Dr. Thompson is giving a speech at the hospital in less than an hour," she announced, looking up from her phone. "She's launching a new program to address healthcare disparities in underserved communities." The community center erupted into motion. Staff members began grabbing coats and keys, while others helped Mrs. Washington toward the door. But Robert remained frozen in his chair, the unread letter from 1963 still in his lap. "I can't," he whispered. "After everything. How can I face her?" Sarah knelt beside him, her voice gentle but firm. "That little boy in the video, the one who went back to help, he's still in there. We all saw it when you walked in here today with that check and your story." She glanced at the envelope. "Maybe it's time to read what Mrs. Washington wrote to that boy." As Robert's shaking hands finally began to open the letter, his phone buzzed. A text message appeared from an unknown number. "I saw the video. I remember you too, Robert. After all these years, we need to talk. Rose." The letter's contents and Rose's message held the power to either heal 6 decades of wounds or deepen them beyond repair. As they rushed toward the hospital where Dr. Thompson waited, none of them could have predicted how their intertwined stories would collide, or how their personal moments of redemption were about to spark a movement that would reach far beyond their city's borders. The community center's doors swung shut behind them, leaving behind only the gentle flutter of papers on the bulletin board, notices for upcoming events that suddenly seemed small compared to the history unfolding in their midst. The hospital auditorium buzzed with anticipation as Dr. Rose Thompson stood at the podium, her silver-streaked hair and confident posture commanding attention. She was midway through her speech about healthcare equality when she spotted them entering: Sarah, Robert, and Mrs. Washington, accompanied by a small crowd from the community center. Her voice faltered for just a moment, 6 decades of memories flooding back at the sight of her former teacher and the boy who had helped her that chaotic day. Robert clutched both the letter and the check, their edges worn from his nervous handling during the car ride. Mrs. Washington's words from 1963, finally read after all these years, had left tear stains on the aged paper. "Dear Robert, your courage today showed me that love can overcome the walls we build between us. Remember this feeling. It's what humanity looks like when we choose kindness over fear." As Dr. Thompson concluded her speech, she did something unexpected. Instead of taking questions, she stepped down from the podium and walked directly toward the group. The audience watched in confused silence as she stopped in front of Robert. "You know," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, "I've been funding anonymous scholarships for students from our old neighborhood for 30 years. Every recipient gets a copy of that photograph, the one of Mrs. Washington leading you to safety. But they never knew the full story." Robert's hands shook as he tried to hand her the check, but Dr. Thompson gently pushed it back. "I saw the video," she continued, "but what people don't know is that I've been watching your journey long before it went viral. That community center where Sarah works, I made sure it got built in our old neighborhood. I've been waiting, hoping someone would break through the walls of prejudice there. Sarah did that just by being herself, just like Mrs. Washington did for us." The room fell silent as Mrs. Washington stepped forward, supported by Sarah. She reached into her purse and pulled out another envelope, not weathered like Robert's, but crisp and new. "I never stopped writing letters," she revealed. "Every year, on the anniversary of that day, I wrote to both of you. 60 years of undelivered hope." She held out the stack of letters, bound together with a faded ribbon similar to the one that had held Robert's single letter. But as Rose and Robert reached for the letters, Sarah suddenly gasped. On the back of each envelope was a small symbol, the same logo that appeared on the scholarship certificates Dr. Thompson had been sending out all these years, the same logo that was on the corner of Robert's check. And there, projected on the screen behind them, the same symbol appeared on the new Healthcare Initiative's banner. It was Mrs. Washington's family crest, a simple design she used to draw on her students' papers as a sign of encouragement. 3 intertwined circles representing unity, courage, and hope. The very values she had taught in her classroom 60 years ago were now woven into the fabric of their city's future. The viral video hadn't just captured a moment of kindness between Sarah and Robert. It had unknowingly exposed decades of quiet determination by 3 people working separately toward the same goal: healing the wounds of the past and building bridges for the future. As the truth dawned on everyone present, Dr. Thompson reached for her phone and pulled up a lit stream. Their story had already inspired hundreds of similar revelations across the country, as people began recognizing and reconnecting with those who had shown them kindness across racial divides years ago. But it was what Mrs. Washington did next that left everyone speechless. From her purse, she pulled out one final envelope, this one addressed to Sarah. Sarah accepted the envelope from Mrs. Washington with trembling hands, aware of the hundreds of eyes watching this moment unfold. Inside was not a letter, but a deed, the property deed to the entire community center building, along with a note that read, "To the next generation of bridge builders. I've watched you work there every day for the past year, carrying the same spirit I tried to instill in my classroom. The building is yours now, to continue what we started." Dr. Thompson stepped forward, placing her hand over Sarah's. "The healthcare initiative I announced today. It's going to be headquartered right there in your community center. We're converting the unused second floor into a free clinic." She turned to Robert, whose check still trembled in his grip. "And your contribution will fund the education program. teaching young healthcare workers about empathy alongside medicine. Robert finally found his voice, thick with emotion. I came here today thinking I could buy redemption with a check. But standing here, seeing how you both spent decades quietly working to heal the same wounds I helped create, I understand now that redemption isn't bought. It's earned through actions, one day at a time. Mrs. Washington's granddaughter, still recording everything on her phone, spoke up. The video comments are flooding in. People are organizing reunions in their own communities, finding those who showed them kindness across racial lines years ago. They're calling it the Bridge Builders Movement. Through tears of joy, Sarah shared her own revelation. You know, that morning when I helped with those groceries, I almost walked past. It had been a long shift. I was tired, and I've faced rejection so many times before. But something made me stop, and now I know what it was. It was all of you laying this groundwork for decades, making it possible for moments like that to matter. As the afternoon sun streamed through the hospital windows, Mrs. Washington gathered Robert and Rose close, recreating the pose from the photograph taken so many years ago. Sarah snapped a picture with her phone, the past and present bridged in a single frame. But this time, there was no fear in their eyes, only hope and healing. The three letters, Robert's from 1963, Rose's years of quiet generosity, and Sarah's unexpected inheritance, lay together on the podium, telling a story of how change really happens, not in grand gestures or viral moments, but in patient, persistent acts of kindness that ripple through generations. As the crowd began to disperse, Mrs. Washington had one final surprise. She pulled out a small, worn journal. I kept track of every act of kindness I witnessed in my classroom, no matter how small, because I believed that someday those seeds would grow into something beautiful. She opened it to a page dated 1963, where she'd written, "Today, Robert went back to help Rose. Remember this, sometimes the children lead the way." The story might have started with a simple act of kindness caught on camera, but it ended with the revelation that kindness had been working silently all along, weaving connections beneath the surface of their lives. Sarah's community center, Rose's healthcare initiative, and Robert's contribution weren't just separate acts of charity. They were pieces of a puzzle that Mrs. Washington had always seen clearly. As they left the hospital that evening, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope. Their viral moment had become something far more meaningful. A reminder that it's never too late to choose kindness, to rebuild bridges, or to become the person you were always meant to be. Sometimes it just takes a simple act of kindness to reveal the true colors of the human heart.